The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as Marcus Wellington adjusted his ceremonial uniform for what felt like the 100th time. His fingers trembled slightly as he fastened the gold buttons, each one bearing the royal crest he had sworn to protect. At 32 years old, Marcus had served as a royal guard for nearly a decade, standing silently at attention through countless state dinners, diplomatic meetings, and royal ceremonies. He was invisible by design, a statue in uniform whose presence was meant to reassure rather than distract. But today, everything was about to change. Marcus had met Sarah Chen 3 years earlier at a charity event outside the palace walls. She was a pediatric nurse volunteering her time at a health fair, her warm smile cutting through the formal atmosphere like sunshine through clouds. He had been assigned to the security detail that day, watching from a distance as she patiently explained vaccination schedules to worried parents. Something about her gentle manner and genuine kindness had drawn him in. When their eyes met across the crowded room, he felt something shift inside his chest. Their courtship had been quiet and private, conducted far from the palace's watchful eyes. Marcus never spoke about his work, and Sarah never pressed him for details. They would meet at small cafes in unremarkable neighborhoods, take walks through public parks, and build a life together in the spaces between his demanding shifts. She understood that his job required discretion, and he loved her all the more for never making him choose between duty and desire. The proposal came on a rainy Tuesday evening in her tiny apartment. Nothing fancy, no elaborate planning. Just Marcus on one knee with his grandmother's ring, his voice catching as he asked her to be his wife. Sarah had said yes before he could finish the sentence, tears streaming down her face as she pulled him into an embrace that felt like coming home. They had planned a small wedding, nothing that would draw attention. Sarah's family would come from across the country, a handful of friends, perhaps a few of Marcus's colleagues from outside the palace. They had booked a modest venue, picked out simple decorations, and prepared themselves for a quiet celebration of their love. Marcus had filled out the necessary paperwork through the palace's human resources department, a routine notification that he was getting married. It was a formality, nothing more. Or so he thought. The trouble began exactly 3 weeks before the wedding date. Marcus was summoned to the office of Lord Chamberlain Edmund Hartley, the man responsible for overseeing all royal household operations. The meeting request came through official channels marked as urgent. Marcus had never been called to the Lord Chamberlain's office before. In 10 years of service, his interactions with palace administration had been minimal and always routine. Lord Hartley was a man in his late 60s, with silver hair perfectly combed and a manner that suggested he had been born wearing a 3-piece suit. His office was lined with portraits of previous chamberlains dating back 3 centuries, each one looking down with the same expression of stern authority. When Marcus entered, Hartley was standing by the window, hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the palace gardens. Marcus stood at attention, waiting. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. Finally, Hartley turned, his expression unreadable. He held a single sheet of paper in his hand, Marcus's wedding notification form. The older man studied Marcus for a long moment before speaking, his voice careful and measured. The Lord Chamberlain explained that Marcus's wedding notification had triggered a review process. As a member of the Royal Guard with direct access to the royal family, certain protocols existed regarding marriage and personal relationships. These protocols, Hartley noted with what seemed like genuine regret, had not been properly communicated to guards upon their hiring. An oversight, he called it, though his tone suggested the word was inadequate. Marcus felt his stomach drop. He asked what kind of protocols. His voice steadied despite the panic beginning to build in his chest. Hartley returned to his desk, setting down the paper with deliberate care. He explained that any royal guard wishing to marry needed approval from the royal household. The potential spouse would need to undergo a background check, and more importantly, the marriage would need to align with certain standards regarding royal protocol and public perception. The words seemed to echo in the quiet office. Marcus struggled to process what he was hearing. He had filled out the form, he protested. He had followed the procedure. Hartley nodded slowly, acknowledging this was true. But the form, he explained, was merely notification. It was not approval. The actual approval process required additional steps that should have been explained years ago but somehow never were. Marcus asked directly whether his wedding was approved. Hartley's pause told him everything he needed to know before the words came. The royal household had concerns, the Lord Chamberlain said carefully. Not about Sarah herself, he hastened to add. By all accounts, she was a respectable young woman with an admirable career. But there were complications regarding the timing, the venue, and certain aspects of how the marriage would be perceived publicly. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Marcus gripped the back of the chair in front of him. He had invitations printed. Family members had booked flights. Sarah had her dress altered just last week. They had put deposits down, made promises, built dreams around this date, and now, 3 weeks before they were meant to stand before their loved ones and exchange vows, he was being told there were concerns. Hartley continued speaking, outlining various protocols and considerations. Royal guards, when they married, were expected to have ceremonies that reflected the dignity of their position. Small weddings in ordinary venues, while perfectly acceptable for civilians, created certain problems for members of the royal household. There were questions about security, about press access, about maintaining the appropriate image. The words flowed over Marcus like cold water, each one chipping away at the future he had carefully constructed. Marcus finally found his voice. He asked what would happen if he proceeded with the wedding as planned. Hartley's expression grew graver. That, he said, would be considered a violation of royal household policy. The consequences could include disciplinary action, possibly even termination of his position. A decade of service, a career he had built from nothing, suddenly hung in the balance. The meeting concluded with Hartley handing Marcus a thick folder of documents outlining the proper procedures for royal guard marriages. He suggested Marcus review them carefully and consider his options. As Marcus left the office, folder clutched in his trembling hands, he realized his quiet life had just been thrown into chaos. He had no idea how he would tell Sarah, no idea how they would move forward, and no idea how a simple wedding had suddenly become a matter of royal protocol and palace politics. Marcus sat in his car in the palace parking lot for nearly an hour after the meeting, staring at the folder without opening it. His phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from Sarah about cake flavors and seating arrangements, each notification another reminder of the impossible situation he now faced. How could he explain this to her? How could he tell the woman he loved that their wedding, planned with such care and joy, was now considered a protocol violation by people she had never met? When he finally drove to her apartment that evening, the folder felt like a lead weight on the passenger seat. Sarah greeted him at the door with her usual bright smile, but it faded the moment she saw his face. She pulled him inside, guided him to the couch, and waited. Marcus had never been good with words, had always been a man of action rather than explanation. But there was no way to act his way out of this mess. He told her everything, about the meeting with Lord Hartley, about the protocols he had never known existed, about the concerns and complications and consequences. Sarah listened in silence, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to something harder to define. When he finished, she sat back processing. Her first question surprised him. She asked why he had never mentioned these kinds of rules before. Marcus explained that he genuinely had not known. In all his years of service, through all the training and briefings and evaluations, no one had ever mentioned marriage protocols for royal guards. He had assumed that filling out the notification form was sufficient, a simple administrative task like updating his address or emergency contacts. The idea that his personal life required approval from the royal household had never occurred to him. Sarah picked up the folder, flipping through the pages with increasing incredulity. The documents outlined requirements that seemed to belong to a different century. Royal guards who married were expected to have ceremonies that reflected appropriate dignity and discretion. The guest lists needed to be approved. The venues needed to meet certain security standards. Even the timing of the wedding needed to be coordinated with the royal family's schedule to avoid conflicts or unwanted attention. More troubling were the sections about the spouse's role and expectations. According to the protocols, the husband or wife of a royal guard was considered an extension of the palace household, subject to certain behavioral standards and public conduct requirements. There were clauses about media interaction, social media usage, and maintaining the confidentiality of palace operations. Sarah would essentially need to sign away aspects of her privacy and freedom simply for marrying the man she loved. She looked up from the documents, her eyes searching his face. She asked the question he had been dreading. Did this mean they could not get married? Marcus took her hands, his military composure finally cracking. He told her honestly that he did not know. If they proceeded with the wedding as planned, he would likely lose his job. If they tried to comply with all these protocols, they would need to cancel everything and start over, following guidelines that felt invasive and unreasonable. Sarah was quiet for a long time, her nurse's training making her naturally inclined to process information carefully before reacting. Finally, she spoke. She said that she loved him, that she wanted to marry him, but she refused to let anonymous bureaucrats dictate the terms of their life together. If his job required him to treat their marriage like a military operation requiring clearance and approval, then maybe it was not the right job. Marcus felt something twist in his chest. The Royal Guard was not just his job. It was his identity, his purpose, the thing that gave structure and meaning to his life. He came from a working-class family with no particular prospects. The Guard had given him discipline, respect, and a sense of belonging to something larger than himself. Walking away would mean abandoning everything he had built. But as he looked at Sarah, at the woman who had brought warmth and joy into his carefully controlled existence, he realized she was right. What kind of life would they have if it began with capitulation to unreasonable demands? What kind of marriage could they build on a foundation of institutional control? The next morning, Marcus requested a meeting with Captain Richard Pierce, the head of the Royal Guard. Pierce was a career military man who had served in the Guard for 25 years, working his way up from the ranks. He was fair but exacting, the kind of leader who commanded respect through competence rather than fear. If anyone could help Marcus navigate this situation, it would be Pierce. The captain listened to Marcus's story without interruption, his weathered face giving nothing away. When Marcus finished, Pierce leaned back in his chair with a heavy sigh. He admitted that Marcus was not the first guard to run into this problem. Over the years, several guards had faced similar situations when trying to marry. Some had complied with the protocols, enduring the invasive process and the restrictions. Others had quietly resigned rather than subject their partners to palace scrutiny. Marcus asked why the protocols existed at all. Pierce explained that they dated back decades, to a time when security concerns were different, and the royal household maintained much stricter control over staff personal lives. In theory, the protocols were meant to protect both the royal family and the guards themselves. In practice, they had become outdated remnants of an earlier era, enforced inconsistently and often forgotten until someone triggered a review. The captain told Marcus something that shifted his perspective entirely. He said that several guards, himself included, had been quietly advocating for changes to these protocols for years. They had filed reports, made recommendations, and argued that the marriage rules were unnecessarily intrusive and potentially discriminatory. But palace bureaucracy moved slowly, and the royal household was generally resistant to change, especially regarding traditions and protocols that had existed for generations. Pierce looked at Marcus directly and told him something off the record. If Marcus chose to proceed with his wedding as planned, it would force the issue. The palace would have to decide whether to actually follow through with disciplinary action against a decorated guard with an exemplary service record, simply for marrying the woman he loved in the manner he chose. The publicity alone might be enough to trigger the policy reform that had been languishing in committee for years. Marcus felt the weight of that statement. Pierce was essentially suggesting that he become a test case, that he put his career on the line to challenge an unjust system. It was not a decision to make lightly. He asked the captain directly what he would do in this situation. Pierce smiled grimly and said that he had gotten married 30 years ago, long before these particular protocols had been formalized. But if he were in Marcus's position today, he would marry the woman he loved and let the chips fall where they may. Marcus left the meeting feeling both empowered and terrified. He spent the rest of the day walking through the city, trying to clear his head and think through his options. By evening, he knew what he needed to do. He needed to talk to Sarah again, to present the situation clearly and let her help make the decision. This was not just about his career or his principles. It was about their future together, and they needed to face it as a team. When he arrived at Sarah's apartment, he found her sitting at her kitchen table surrounded by their wedding binder and the palace protocol documents. She had been making notes, cross-referencing requirements, and apparently doing her own research. She looked up as he entered. and he saw determination in her eyes that he had never seen before. Before he could speak, she told him that she had made some calls and done some thinking, and she had a plan. Sarah had spent the entire day researching employment law, royal household policies, and workers' rights. As a healthcare professional, she was familiar with complex institutional hierarchies and bureaucratic systems, and she approached the palace protocols the same way she would approach a difficult medical case. She needed to understand the problem before she could find the solution. She explained to Marcus that she had called her cousin, a labor attorney who specialized in employment disputes. Without revealing too many specifics, she had described the basic situation. An employee being told they needed approval for their marriage or faced disciplinary action. Her cousin had been immediately concerned, suggesting that such policies might violate several employment laws, particularly if they were being applied inconsistently or without proper notification. Marcus listened as Sarah walked him through what she had learned. The palace, as an employer, certainly had the right to implement security protocols and conduct background checks on employees and their associates. However, requiring approval for a marriage based on subjective criteria like appropriate dignity or public perception was potentially problematic. If the palace had never properly communicated these requirements during the hiring process or in employee handbooks, their enforcement became even more questionable. Sarah pulled out a page from her notes. She had found references to other palace employees who had married without going through elaborate approval processes. Chefs, administrative staff, even some lower-ranking security personnel had married freely with only the standard notification required. The fact that royal guards faced different, stricter requirements suggested an inequality in how policies were applied across the household. But Sarah's plan went beyond legal arguments. She had realized something important. The palace was concerned about public perception, about maintaining an image of dignity and tradition. What if they gave the palace exactly what they claimed to want, but on their own terms? What if they planned a wedding that was undeniably dignified and appropriate, but remained true to their own values and vision? Marcus was skeptical. He reminded her of the extensive requirements in the protocol documents, the approved venues, the guest list reviews, the security assessments. How could they possibly meet those standards in 3 weeks while also maintaining control over their own celebration? Sarah smiled, and he recognized the look. It was the same expression she wore when facing a particularly challenging patient case. The moment when she shifted from worried to determined. She proposed a compromise that would call the palace's bluff. They would send a formal letter to Lord Hartley, acknowledging the protocols and proposing a modified wedding plan that addressed the stated security and dignity concerns while preserving their original vision. They would offer to have security personnel review their venue, agree to reasonable guest list documentation, and commit to avoiding media attention. But they would not cancel their wedding, would not postpone, and would not submit their personal lives for approval like subjects seeking a favor from the crown. The letter would be respectful but firm, professional but unyielding. They would frame it not as defiance but as cooperation, as two reasonable people trying to work within an unexpected system while maintaining their fundamental rights. And here was the clever part. They would send copies to the Human Resources Department, to Captain Pierce, and to the palace's legal office. By making their compliance efforts official and documented, they would create a paper trail that could protect Marcus if the palace decided to pursue disciplinary action. Marcus felt a surge of admiration for this woman who was supposed to be walking into a marriage but had instead walked into a bureaucratic battle. He asked what would happen if the palace rejected their proposal. Sarah's expression turned serious. Then, she said, they would proceed with their wedding anyway, and Marcus would have to decide whether his job was worth surrendering his autonomy as a human being. They spent the rest of the evening drafting the letter together. Sarah handled most of the writing, her experience with medical documentation giving her an edge in formal communication. Marcus contributed details about palace procedures and proper forms of address. By midnight, they had a document that was respectful, professional, and subtly revolutionary. It acknowledged the palace's concerns while asserting their own rights, proposed solutions while refusing to beg for permission. The next morning, Marcus delivered the letter personally to Lord Hartley's office. The chamberlain was not available, but his assistant accepted the envelope with a promised assurance it would be reviewed promptly. Marcus also gave copies to Captain Pierce and dropped one at the Human Resources office. Then he returned to his duties, standing post at the palace's east entrance, externally calm, while internally preparing for whatever storm might follow. 3 days passed with no response. Marcus performed his duties mechanically, his mind constantly elsewhere. Sarah sent encouraging texts during her breaks at the hospital, reminding him that silence might actually be a good sign. Perhaps the palace was taking their proposal seriously. Perhaps they were consulting with legal advisors. Perhaps they were realizing that their protocols were more trouble than they were worth. On the 4th day, Marcus was summoned once again to Lord Hartley's office. This time he was not alone. Also present were the palace's legal counsel, a stern woman named Victoria Barnes, and the deputy head of security, Commander James Walsh. The atmosphere was tense but not hostile. Hartley gestured for Marcus to sit, an informality that seemed significant. The Chamberlain began by acknowledging receipt of Marcus's letter. He noted that it was well written and raised several points that deserved serious consideration. Victoria Barnes took over, explaining that the legal office had reviewed both the letter and the relevant protocols. She spoke carefully, choosing her words with obvious precision. The palace, she said, valued its traditions and took security concerns seriously. However, she continued, there was recognition that some protocols had not evolved with changing times and legal standards. Marcus felt his heart rate increase. This was not the response he had expected. Barnes continued, explaining that Marcus's letter had prompted a broader review of marriage policies for royal household staff. While that review would take time, there was agreement that the current situation needed immediate resolution. Commander Walsh spoke next, addressing the security concerns. He said that the venue Marcus and Sarah had chosen was actually quite suitable from a security standpoint. It was a small garden venue with limited access points and good sightlines, easier to secure than many of the palace-approved locations. Lord Hartley cleared his throat, reclaiming control of the meeting. He said that after considerable discussion, the royal household was prepared to approve Marcus's marriage, with certain conditions. These conditions, he emphasized, were being applied as a transitional measure while the broader policy review was conducted. Marcus would need to provide a final guest list 2 weeks before the wedding for security review, not approval. Security personnel would conduct a brief assessment of the venue, but only to ensure basic safety standards. And both Marcus and Sarah would attend a single meeting with the palace's protocol office to discuss expectations regarding media interaction and confidentiality. Marcus struggled to process what he was hearing. Was this actually happening? Were they approving his wedding? Hartley seemed to sense his confusion. The Chamberlain said explicitly that Marcus was cleared to proceed with his wedding as planned, with only minor accommodations for security and protocol. The extensive requirements in the original documents would not be enforced in his case. But there was something else. Barnes spoke again, her tone carrying a warning. She said that this decision was being made with the understanding that Marcus and Sarah would conduct themselves appropriately. Any behavior that brought negative attention to the palace or compromised security would be taken seriously. Marcus was being given flexibility and trust, and the palace expected that trust to be honored. Marcus agreed immediately. He had no intention of courting controversy or attention. He simply wanted to marry the woman he loved in the manner they had chosen. Hartley stood, signaling the meeting's end. As Marcus rose to leave, the Chamberlain said one more thing, something that seemed almost personal. He mentioned that he had married his own wife 40 years ago, in a small ceremony that his superiors at the time had considered beneath his station. But it had been the happiest day of his life, and he saw no reason why Marcus should be denied the same joy. Marcus left the meeting in a daze, barely remembering to salute the officers properly before exiting. He made it to his car before pulling out his phone with shaking hands and calling Sarah. She answered on the first ring, her voice tight with anxiety. When he told her the news, she went silent for so long he thought the call had dropped. Then she burst into tears, not of sadness but of overwhelming relief. They met for lunch at their favorite small cafe, the one where they had shared their first meal together 3 years earlier. Sarah looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes betraying sleepless nights she had not mentioned. Marcus realized with a pang of guilt how much stress this situation had placed on her. She had faced it with such strength and determination, that he had almost forgotten she was also afraid of losing their dream. Over sandwiches they barely touched, they discussed what came next. The palace's conditions were reasonable, far less intrusive than the original protocols. Providing a guest list was something they would have done anyway for catering purposes. The security assessment made sense given Marcus's position, and the protocol meeting, while slightly annoying, was just one afternoon of their lives. They had won, or at least avoided losing completely. But Sarah had questions about what this really meant. She wanted to know if Marcus's job was secure, if there would be retaliation down the line, if this approval could be revoked. Marcus told her honestly that he did not know for certain. Captain Pierce had suggested that forcing the issue might lead to policy reform, and it seemed that prediction was coming true. But bureaucracies were unpredictable, and personalities within the palace could shift. Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. She told him something she had been thinking about during all those sleepless nights. She said that if this experience had taught her anything, it was that they needed to build a life that could not be controlled by institutional policies and powerful people they would never meet. She loved Marcus for who he was, not for his position or uniform. If being a royal guard meant constantly negotiating for basic human dignity, perhaps they needed to consider other paths. Marcus felt his throat tighten. He knew she was right, but the thought of leaving the guard felt like contemplating an amputation. Still, what was the point of protecting the royal family if he could not protect his own happiness? They agreed to table the discussion until after the wedding. For now, they would focus on celebrating their love and creating the day they had imagined. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Sarah finalized arrangements with their vendors, confirmed travel plans with family members, and somehow managed to work full shifts at the hospital between wedding tasks. Marcus submitted the guest list to palace security, a straightforward process that took less than an hour. The security team reviewed their venue on a quiet Tuesday morning, spending about 30 minutes walking the perimeter and asking basic questions about access points. They approved it without hesitation. The protocol meeting was scheduled for the Friday before the wedding. Marcus and Sarah arrived at the palace together, her first time passing through the famous gates. She squeezed his hand as they walked through corridors lined with portraits of monarchs dating back centuries. Marcus found himself seeing the palace through her eyes, noticing the grandeur and history he had long since stopped registering. They were met by Catherine Morrison, a middle-aged woman from the protocol office who had a surprisingly warm demeanor. She invited them to sit in a comfortable office that felt more like a living room than a bureaucratic space. Catherine explained that this meeting was really just a conversation about expectations and best practices, not a lecture or interrogation. She talked about media interaction first. As the spouse of a royal guard, Sarah would likely never be of interest to the press, but if she were ever approached, the palace preferred that household staff and their families decline comment and refer reporters to the official press office. This was not a demand, Catherine emphasized, but a request that helped maintain everyone's privacy and security. Regarding confidentiality, the expectations were common sense. Marcus's work often involved proximity to the royal family and knowledge of their schedules and movements. Sarah should not share any information Marcus might mention at home, particularly regarding security procedures or royal family whereabouts. Again, Catherine framed this as mutual protection. Loose talk could endanger not just the royals, but Marcus and his colleagues as well. Sarah listened carefully and asked thoughtful questions. Could she mention on social media that she was married to someone who worked at the palace? Catherine said yes, as long as she did not share specifics about his role or schedule. Could she post wedding photos online? Of course, Catherine said with a smile, though it might be wise to avoid shots that showed too much of Marcus's uniform details. These were guidelines for safety, not restrictions for control. The meeting lasted less than an hour. As they prepared to leave, Catherine did something unexpected. She apologized. She said that the situation Marcus had faced should never have happened, that the protocols had been poorly communicated and unfairly enforced. The palace was an institution with centuries of history, she explained, and sometimes that history became a burden rather than a heritage. She hoped that Marcus and Sarah's wedding would be everything they dreamed, and that their marriage would be free from institutional interference. Walking back through the palace corridors, Sarah whispered to Marcus that the meeting had not been bad at all. Catherine had treated them like intelligent adults, not subjects requiring instruction. Maybe, Sarah suggested, the palace was actually changing, even if slowly. Marcus wanted to share her optimism but remained wary. Institutions did not change their nature overnight, no matter how reasonable individual representatives might be. The week of the wedding arrived with spring weather that seemed impossibly perfect. Sarah's family began arriving from across the country, filling hotels and spare bedrooms. Marcus's mother came from her small coastal town, tears in her eyes at seeing her son so happy. Colleagues from both their workplaces sent gifts and well wishes. The world narrowed to preparations and celebrations, to picking up tuxedos and having final dress fittings, to rehearsal dinners and last-minute seating charts. Marcus had requested the wedding day off months earlier, a standard process. But Captain Pierce did something unexpected. He assigned several off-duty guards to provide informal security at the wedding, a gesture that was both touching and practical. Pierce himself would attend as a guest, along with a handful of other senior guards who had served with Marcus over the years. Their presence would ensure that any potential security issues were handled quietly, allowing Marcus and Sarah to enjoy their day without worry. The night before the wedding, Marcus stood alone in his apartment, his dress uniform hanging freshly pressed on the closet door. Tomorrow he would wear civilian clothes, would stand before his loved ones as simply Marcus, not Guard Wellington. He thought about the path that had brought him to this moment, the unexpected obstacles and the small victories. He thought about Sarah's courage in facing down palace bureaucracy, and about the people within that system who had chosen compassion over protocol. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. She wrote that she could not sleep, that she was too excited and nervous and happy all at once. She said that no matter what challenges they had faced or would face in the future, she knew they could handle it together. She said she could not wait to become his wife, to start their life as partners in every sense. Marcus typed back that he loved her, that he would see her tomorrow, that their wedding would be perfect because she would be there. He set down his phone and looked out the window at the city lights spreading into the distance. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of something new, not just a marriage but a different way of living. He had stood guard over others for so long. Now it was time to stand together with the person who had chosen to stand beside him. Somewhere in the palace across the city, Lord Chamberlain Hartley was also awake, reviewing documents related to the royal household's marriage policy reform. Marcus's situation had indeed forced the issue, had brought attention to protocols that had languished in bureaucratic limbo for too long. Changes were coming, slowly but inevitably, and it had taken a young guard and a determined nurse to push the ancient institution toward modernity. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of cherry blossoms through the garden venue. Marcus woke early from habit, his internal alarm clock still calibrated to palace guard duty shifts despite having the day off. He lay in bed for a few moments, letting the reality settle over him. Today he would marry Sarah Chen, and after weeks of bureaucratic battles and institutional obstacles, nothing stood in their way. His brother arrived at 9 to help him get ready, bringing coffee and pastries and a running commentary designed to keep Marcus's nerves at bay. They dressed slowly, Marcus trading his usual military precision for the unfamiliar territory of civilian formal wear. The suit fit perfectly, but without the weight of his uniform and ceremonial sword, he felt somehow lighter and more vulnerable at the same time. Across the city, Sarah was surrounded by her bridesmaids in a hotel suite that had been transformed into a preparation headquarters. Her mother carefully helped her into the dress, a simple but elegant creation that Sarah had fallen in love with months ago. As she looked at herself in the mirror, she thought about how close they had come to losing this day. The palace protocols, the meetings, the stress of not knowing whether Marcus's career would survive their desire to marry on their own terms. But they had persevered, and now nothing else mattered except the promises they would make to each other. The venue was a small botanical garden on the edge of the city, a place where nature and careful cultivation created spaces of quiet beauty. Sarah had chosen it because it reminded her of the park where Marcus had proposed, the same sense of being separate from the noise and demands of the world. As guests began arriving in the early afternoon, they found seats arranged in a semicircle around a small gazebo, with flowers blooming and careful chaos all around. Marcus arrived an hour before the ceremony, greeting guests and trying not to pace nervously. He was touched by the turnout. Many of his fellow guards had come, some in uniform and others in civilian clothes, their presence a statement of solidarity. Captain Pierce arrived with his wife, shaking Marcus's hand with genuine warmth. Even Lord Chamberlain Hartley made a brief appearance, staying in the background but offering Marcus a respectful nod that somehow felt like a benediction. The off-duty guards Pierce had assigned to security were almost invisible, positioned casually around the perimeter. To other guests, they looked like attendees who had arrived early. But Marcus recognized the professional way they scanned the crowd and monitored access points. Their presence allowed him to relax, to trust that if any problems arose, they would be handled quietly and efficiently. Sarah's family filled several rows, a boisterous clan of aunts, uncles, and cousins who brought laughter and energy to the gathering. Marcus's smaller family group sat nearby, his mother already dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Friends from both their lives mingled easily, united by their love for the couple even if they had never met before today. At precisely 3 o'clock, music began to play. A string quartet that Sarah had discovered at a community concert performed a piece that was both classical and contemporary, honoring tradition while embracing the present. The guests rose as Sarah appeared at the garden path, walking slowly toward the gazebo with her father beside her. Marcus felt his breath catch. Sarah was radiant, her dress catching the afternoon light, her smile bright enough to rival the sun. All the stress and struggle of the past weeks melted away. The palace protocols, the bureaucratic obstacles, the fears about his career, none of it mattered in the face of this moment. She was walking toward him, choosing him, committing to build a life together regardless of institutional pressures or royal expectations. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. They had chosen a friend to officiate, a former professor of Sarah's who had become a mentor and confidant. She spoke about love as both a feeling and a choice, about the importance of facing challenges together rather than apart. She referenced the struggles they had overcome to reach this day, not with specific details but with an acknowledgement that their path to marriage had tested their commitment before they had even made their vows. When it came time for the vows themselves, Marcus and Sarah had written their own. Marcus spoke first, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. He promised to honor her independence, to support her dreams, to face whatever obstacles life presented as partners rather than as individuals. He promised to never let institutional demands come before their relationship, to remember that his identity was not defined by his job, but by his character and his choices. Sarah's vows brought tears to many eyes. She spoke about finding in Marcus a man who stood for something larger than himself, but never forgot his humanity. She promised to be his safe place, the person he could be vulnerable with after days of standing at rigid attention. She promised to fight beside him, not just for their relationship but for their right to live authentically. And she promised to love him not despite his dedication to duty, but because of the integrity that dedication represented. The exchange of rings felt like sealing a pact that went beyond traditional marriage. These were two people who had refused to compromise their values, who had stood up to an ancient institution and emerged with their dignity intact. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the applause that erupted was not just celebration but affirmation. The reception flowed seamlessly from ceremony, with guests moving to a nearby pavilion where tables had been arranged under strings of lights. The food was simple but delicious, prepared by a catering company that Sarah's hospital colleagues had recommended. There were toasts and laughter, stories shared about both Marcus and Sarah that painted pictures of their lives before they had found each other. Captain Pierce gave a toast that struck a balance between humor and sincerity. He spoke about Marcus as a guard, praising his dedication and professionalism. But then he shifted tone, talking about the importance of remembering that guards were human beings first, that their service should enhance their lives rather than consume them. He raised his glass to a marriage built on equality and respect, and to the hope that the palace would continue learning from the example Marcus and Sarah had set. As the afternoon stretched into evening, Marcus found himself pulled aside by several colleagues who wanted private conversations. They thanked him for what he had done, for challenging protocols that many had quietly resented but never felt empowered to question. One younger guard, newly married himself, admitted that he had gone through the full approval process and found it humiliating. He wished he had shown Marcus's courage. Marcus told him honestly that it had not felt like courage at the time, just desperation and love. Lord Hartley departed before dinner, but not before speaking briefly with both Marcus and Sarah. He told them that their situation had accelerated discussions that needed to happen. A committee was being formed to review all household staff policies related to personal relationships and family life. The goal was to bring palace employment practices into alignment with modern legal standards and basic human dignity. It would take time, Hartley acknowledged, but change was coming. Sarah thanked him for attending and for his role in resolving their situation. Hartley smiled, a rare expression that softened his usually stern features. He said that he had spent 40 years navigating palace politics and tradition, and sometimes it took fresh eyes to see when traditions had become obstacles. He wished them happiness and quietly took his leave. The dancing began as twilight settled over the garden. Marcus and Sarah's first dance was to a song they had discovered together, something neither too formal nor too casual, just right for two people who had found their own path. As they moved together, Marcus whispered to Sarah that he could not believe this was real, that they had actually made it happen. Sarah whispered back that she had never doubted they would, that she had seen his strength even when he had not seen it himself. Later in the evening, Marcus found himself standing with a group of guards near the edge of the reception area. They were discussing the policy review that Hartley had mentioned, speculating about what changes might come. One guard mentioned that he had been afraid to even date seriously, worried that any relationship would face the same scrutiny Marcus had experienced. Another said that several guards had married quietly without notifying the palace at all, essentially living in violation of protocols they found unjust. The conversation revealed a truth that Marcus had not fully understood. His situation had not been unique, just uniquely public. Many guards had struggled with the tension between their professional duties and their personal lives, had made compromises or sacrifices that they resented. By standing his ground and forcing the palace to address the issue directly, Marcus had become an inadvertent advocate for reform. Captain Pierce joined the group, drink in hand and tie loosened from his earlier formality. He told them something that he had not shared before. Years ago, when he was a young guard, he had wanted to marry a woman his superiors considered inappropriate. She came from a working-class background, had no formal education, and worked as a waitress. The palace had strongly suggested he reconsider the relationship. Pierce had complied, breaking off the engagement and eventually. The honeymoon was brief, just a long weekend at a coastal retreat where Marcus and Sarah could disconnect from the pressures of palace politics and hospital emergencies. They walked along beaches, ate fresh seafood at small restaurants, and talked about their future with a freedom that felt intoxicating. For 3 days, Marcus was not a royal guard and Sarah was not a nurse. They were simply two people starting a life together, and the simplicity of it was more luxurious than any grand vacation could have been. Returning to reality on Monday morning was jarring. Marcus reported for duty to find that his wedding had become something of a topic of conversation among palace staff. The kitchen workers wanted details about the food, the administrative assistants asked about Sarah's dress, and even some of the senior household members made polite inquiries about how the day had gone. The attention was mostly positive but also slightly uncomfortable. Marcus had spent his career being invisible, and suddenly people were seeing him as a person rather than a uniform. His first shift back was uneventful, standing post at the palace's south entrance during a routine day of meetings and administrative work. But during his break, he was approached by a guard he barely knew, a younger man named Thomas who had joined the service only 2 years earlier. Thomas asked if they could speak privately, his manner nervous and urgent. They walked to a quiet corner of the staff courtyard. Thomas explained that he had been dating someone for 8 months, a relationship that was getting serious. He had been terrified to notify the palace, had been considering breaking up with his girlfriend rather than face the protocol process. But Marcus's wedding had given him hope. He wanted to know what advice Marcus could offer, how he had navigated the system. Marcus felt the weight of Thomas's expectations and tried to manage them realistically. He explained that his situation had been resolved through a combination of advocacy, legal awareness, and fortunate timing. He told Thomas about Captain Pierce's support, about Sarah's research into employment law, about their decision to stand firm while still showing willingness to compromise on reasonable security concerns. But he also warned that not every situation would resolve the same way, that institutional change was slow and unpredictable. Thomas listened intently, taking mental notes. He asked if Marcus thought things were really changing, or if his case had been an exception. Marcus answered honestly that he did not know yet. The Policy Review Committee had been formed, but committees could study issues for years without implementing meaningful reform. The real test would come when the next guard tried to marry and faced either updated, fairer protocols or the same obstacles Marcus had encountered. Over the following weeks, Marcus became an unofficial advisor to several guards dealing with relationship questions. Some wanted to know if they needed to notify the palace about casual dating. Others were considering proposals and wanted guidance about timing and procedures. A few older guards shared their own stories of navigating palace expectations around marriage and family life, revealing a complex history of accommodation and resistance that most guards had never discussed openly. Sarah, meanwhile, had returned to her nursing shifts, but she found herself thinking differently about institutional hierarchies and workers' rights. The hospital where she worked had its own bureaucratic problems, policies that seemed designed more to protect administration than to serve staff or patients. She began attending union meetings, asking questions about how policies were made and whether staff had real input. Her experience with the palace had awakened something in her, a recognition that institutional power only changed when people demanded better. One evening over dinner, Sarah told Marcus about a conversation she had with a colleague whose husband worked for the city government. The colleague had mentioned similar issues with outdated employment policies around family leave and personal time. It made Sarah wonder how many people across different institutions were quietly suffering under archaic rules, never challenging them because the system felt too big and powerful to fight. Marcus suggested that maybe their experience could help others beyond just the palace. Sarah's eyes lit up. She proposed writing about what they had been through, not for publicity but to create a resource for others facing similar situations. They could outline the legal principles involved, the strategies that worked, the importance of documentation and allies within the system. It would not mention the palace specifically, but would speak to the broader experience of workers navigating institutional control over personal lives. They spent several evenings working on the document together, Sarah doing most of the writing, while Marcus contributed specific examples and practical advice. The result was a 10-page guide that they titled, "Protecting Your Personal Life in Institutional Employment." They shared it first with Captain Pierce, who read it carefully and made a few suggestions for clarity. Then they quietly distributed it among palace staff, letting it spread through informal networks. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Guards, administrative staff, and even some senior household members reached out to thank them. Several people mentioned they had kept copies to share with friends in other fields facing similar issues. One older administrative assistant told Sarah that she wished such a resource had existed 30 years earlier when she had faced pressure to hide her same-sex relationship to protect her job, but not everyone was pleased. About 6 weeks after the wedding, Marcus was called to a meeting with a palace administrator he had never dealt with before, a man named Jeffrey Winters who worked in the personnel office. Winters was formal and cold, his disapproval evident from the moment Marcus entered his office. Winters got straight to the point. He had heard about the guide Marcus and Sarah had created, and he considered it inappropriate. Palace employment matters were internal affairs, not subjects for public discussion or documentation. By creating and distributing such a guide, Marcus had violated confidentiality expectations and potentially exposed the palace to legal complications. Marcus kept his composure, though anger simmered beneath his professional exterior. He pointed out that the guide made no specific mention of the palace and contained only general information about employment law and workers' rights. Nothing in it was confidential or proprietary. Winters dismissed this argument, insisting that the guide's origin and purpose were clearly tied to palace employment and, therefore, represented unauthorized disclosure of internal processes. The meeting ended with Winters issuing a formal warning. Marcus was told to cease distributing the guide and to refrain from any further activities that could be construed as criticism of palace policies. The warning would go in his personnel file, a permanent mark that could affect future evaluations and advancement opportunities. Marcus left the meeting shaken, but also furious. After everything they had been through, after the palace had approved his wedding and supposedly committed to policy reform, he was being punished for trying to help others. He went straight to Captain Pierce, who listened to the account with a darkening expression. Pierce made a phone call, right there in front of Marcus, to someone he addressed as Victoria. Marcus recognized the name. Victoria Barnes, the legal counsel who had been present at his earlier meeting with Lord Hartley. Pierce explained the situation concisely, his tone professional but edged with anger. He listened for a few moments, then thanked her and hung up. The captain told Marcus to go home for the day, that this would be handled. Marcus wanted to argue, wanted to know what was happening, but Pierce's expression made it clear that questions would not be welcome. Marcus left the palace feeling like he was back in crisis mode, the brief peace of his newlywed life shattered by institutional retaliation. At home, Sarah was furious when he told her what had happened. She wanted to call a lawyer, to fight back immediately, but Marcus convinced her to wait, to trust that Pierce was handling it. They spent a tense evening trying to distract themselves with television and conversation, both of them constantly checking Marcus's phone for updates. The call came at 9 that evening. It was Pierce, his voice tired but satisfied. He told Marcus that the warning had been rescinded and removed from his file. Geoffrey Winters had been acting outside his authority, imposing his personal views rather than enforcing actual policy. Victoria Barnes had reviewed the guide and found nothing that violated confidentiality or employment terms. Moreover, Lord Hartley had been informed of the situation and had expressed displeasure that a guard who had cooperated fully with palace requests was being harassed for helping colleagues understand their rights. Marcus felt relief wash over him. He asked Pierce what would happen to Winters. The captain said that was not Marcus's concern, but his tone suggested that Winters would face consequences for overstepping. Pierce added something else. The Policy Review Committee had been asking for examples of how current protocols affected staff morale and retention. Marcus and Sarah's guide would be submitted as evidence of the need for clearer, fairer policies. After hanging up, Marcus held Sarah close, feeling the adrenaline of the day finally drain away. She whispered that she hated how the palace seemed to take one step forward and 2 steps back, creating new obstacles as fast as they resolved old ones. Marcus agreed. 6 months after the wedding, the Policy Review Committee released its preliminary recommendations. The document was nearly 50 pages long, covering everything from marriage protocols to family leave policies to expectations around staff personal conduct. Marcus received a copy through Captain Pierce, who told him to read it carefully before the staff meeting scheduled for the following week. The recommendations were more comprehensive than Marcus had dared hope. The marriage approval process would be eliminated entirely for all household staff below senior management level. Background checks would still be conducted for security purposes, but the checks would be standardized and could not be used to deny permission to marry. The concept of appropriate dignity would be removed from all policy language, replaced with specific objective security and confidentiality requirements. Additionally, the committee recommended creating an ombudsman position, someone outside the normal chain of command who could address staff concerns about unfair treatment or policy violations. They proposed regular policy reviews to ensure employment practices remained current with legal standards. And they suggested mandatory training for all supervisors and managers on respecting staff privacy and personal autonomy. The staff meeting to discuss the recommendations drew a larger crowd than usual. Guards, administrative workers, kitchen staff, and maintenance personnel filled the palace's small assembly hall. Lord Hartley presented the findings himself, his manner more casual than Marcus had ever seen. He acknowledged that the review had revealed practices that were outdated and sometimes unjust. The palace prided itself on tradition, he said, but tradition should serve the people who made the institution function, not burden them with unnecessary restrictions. Questions followed, some skeptical and others hopeful. One administrative assistant asked how long implementation would take. Hartley admitted it would not happen overnight. The recommendations needed approval from senior palace officials and legal review to ensure they did not create new problems. But he committed to quarterly updates and transparency about the process. A senior guard asked what would happen to staff who had been previously disciplined under old policies. Would their records be cleared? Hartley paused, then said that was a fair question that the committee had not specifically addressed. He promised to get an answer. Marcus saw Captain Pierce nod slightly from across the room, a gesture of approval for the question and the response. After the meeting, Marcus found himself surrounded by colleagues wanting to discuss the recommendations. The energy in the room was different than anything he had experienced in his years at the palace. People were actually hopeful about change, actually believing that their work environment might improve. Several guards thanked Marcus directly for his role in prompting the review, though he kept insisting he had only wanted to marry his girlfriend without interference. Thomas, the young guard who had first sought Marcus's advice, pulled him aside. He was grinning broadly. He told Marcus that he had proposed to his girlfriend the previous weekend and she had said yes. He had submitted his marriage notification that morning, prepared to fight if necessary. But the notification had been processed as simple information, with no demands for approval or invasive scrutiny. The preliminary recommendations were already changing how staff were being treated, even before official implementation. Marcus felt a complex mix of emotions. Pride that his and Sarah's struggle had contributed to positive change. Relief that others would not face the same obstacles, but also a lingering frustration about how hard it had been to achieve what should have been basic respect for workers' autonomy. He shared Thomas's joy but could not quite shake the anger about the system that had required challenging in the first place. That evening, Marcus told Sarah about the meeting and the recommendations. She listened while preparing dinner, her hands working automatically while her mind processed the implications. When he finished, she turned to face him directly. She said that what they had achieved was important but incomplete. The palace was changing because staff had demanded better. But how many people in how many institutions never demanded anything because they felt powerless? Sarah had been thinking about this question for months. Her experience with hospital bureaucracy, conversations with friends in various fields, and research into labor rights had convinced her that institutional resistance to workers' personal autonomy was widespread. She wanted to do something larger than their guide, something that could reach beyond the palace and help others recognize they had power to challenge unjust policies. She proposed starting a small nonprofit organization focused on workers' rights in institutional employment. Not a legal aid service, there were already organizations doing that work, but a resource hub offering education, strategy guides, and community support for people navigating conflicts between their employers and their personal lives. Marcus could contribute his experience with hierarchical institutions, and Sarah would handle the organizational and outreach aspects. Marcus was taken aback. Starting a nonprofit was a huge undertaking, requiring time, money, and expertise they might not have. But as Sarah outlined her vision, he began to see the potential. They had learned so much through their own struggle, and that knowledge could genuinely help others. The guide they had created was proof that people wanted and needed such resources. They spent the next several months developing the idea, working in the evenings and weekends around their jobs. Sarah took courses on nonprofit management and grant writing. Marcus consulted with labor rights attorneys to ensure their information would be legally sound. They created a website, built a collection of resources, and began reaching out to workers in various institutions who might benefit from their work. The response was immediate and humbling. Teachers dealing with school district policies that interfered with their personal lives. Healthcare workers facing hospital rules about relationships and outside employment. Government employees navigating complex regulations about political activity and public speech. The common thread was people who loved their work, but resented institutional attempts to control their lives beyond professional duties. 6 months after the policy committee's recommendations, Marcus received notice that his formal wedding anniversary would be marked by the palace with a small reception honoring staff who had gotten married that year. It was a new tradition, part of the palace's effort to better recognize and celebrate staff personal lives. Marcus was ambivalent about attending. Part of him wanted nothing more to do with palace ceremonies and formalities. But Sarah convinced him it would be meaningful for other staff to see leadership acknowledge their relationships as worthy of celebration. The reception was held in one of the palace's smaller gardens on a mild autumn afternoon. About 20 couples were present, representing marriages from the past year. Lord Hartley attended along with several senior staff members. The atmosphere was casual, with refreshments and opportunities for people to mingle rather than formal. Presentations. Hartley made brief remarks, acknowledging that the palace had not always served its staff well in matters of personal life and family. He thanked the policy committee for their work and announced that most of their recommendations had been approved for implementation beginning the next quarter. The ombudsman position would be filled within 2 months. The marriage approval protocols were officially abolished as of that day, and training for managers on respecting staff autonomy would begin immediately. The announcement drew applause, genuine appreciation from staff who had waited months for confirmation that change was really happening. Marcus found himself shaking hands with colleagues, accepting congratulations that felt strangely misplaced. He had not set out to be a reformer or advocate. He had just wanted to marry the woman he loved without bureaucratic interference. Sarah, standing beside him in a dress the color of autumn leaves, squeezed his hand. She whispered that he might not have intended to change anything, but intention mattered less than impact. They had stood up when it would have been easier to back down, and that choice had rippled outward in ways they could not have predicted. As the reception wound down and they prepared to leave, Captain Pierce approached them one final time. He told them that he was retiring at the end of the year, stepping down after 28 years of service. He had stayed longer than planned to see the policy reforms through, wanting to ensure they were properly implemented. Now it was time for younger leaders to take the guard forward into a more modern era. Pierce told Marcus something he had not shared before. After their conversation about his own failed engagement decades earlier, he had reached out to the woman he had let go. They had met for coffee, talked about their lives and choices. She was happily remarried with grown children, and they had parted as friends. But the conversation had given him closure he had not realized he needed. Marcus's courage had prompted that closure, had helped him make peace with old regrets. Marcus felt emotion catch in his throat. He thanked Pierce for everything, for the support during the wedding crisis, for the mentorship over the years, for using his position to protect rather than control. Pierce waved away the thanks with characteristic gruffness, but his eyes were bright with fee.